So this last Tuesday, myself, Eric, Rafa, John Root, Chase Adams, we went to this pastor's gathering. There's about 14 guys who desired to be in pastoral ministry at Pella, and 4 of these guys came with me. And it was with a guy named Kent Hughes, and he was talking about the strength of God and our weakness. And I think as I read these chapters, as I kept hearing him talk, that's what kept unpacking. I mean, honestly, it kept coming up in my mind. That feels like that's what's being stressed. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at 5 stories in Genesis 12, 13, and 14, okay? And then at the end of those 5 stories, even though there's much to learn from them, meaning if you look at, say, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, it says, by way of example, the Israelites lived their life, and we can look back and go, there's something to learn about Abraham in this. There's something to learn about Sarai in this. Even though that's true, I think the larger lesson is found in all these chapters together, okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the big point, what I think is the big point. Hopefully we can get that right. So let's start first where, if you were in Glendale last week, a guy named Frank Switzer talked through. The first story comes with these first 5 verses, okay? Here's how the story starts. In light of God giving this declaration that he is God of the nations and he has a plan for the nations. Okay, God, there's brokenness in the world. All these nations from the Tower of Babel are spread. What's your plan? What's your plan? My plan is Abram, is how he responds. Verse 1 of chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. First, notice there's 7 blessings, or I guess 7 declarations. It's called the Abrahamic blessing, or Abrahamic call. First is that Abram's going to be a great nation. Number 2, that God is going to bless him. Also notice in the text there that he's going to make his name great. Number 4, he's going to be a blessing to others. Number 5, you can see it there, everyone who blesses Abraham, not just Abraham's blessed, but everyone who blesses him will also be blessed. Number 6, everyone who curses or dishonors Abraham will be cursed. And then number 7, all the families of the earth will be blessed through him. These 7 elements are picked up. And this includes land, it includes people, it includes riches. This is where the story is picking up and going from here. Now, the reason verses 4 and 5 are important, because Abraham leaves that place, he leaves his home country, and he follows this call that God gives to Abraham. And in doing so, there's 2 people that are mentioned. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and all the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they sent out to go to the land of Canaan, which is, if you don't know, the land of Canaan is the promised land. So they set out to go where God gives this promise. Now, the 2 people that are mentioned are very important. It's Sarai, who's with him, and Lot, his nephew. Now, the reason they're important is the next 3 stories are about those 2 people, okay? So they're going to matter for us. Here's the second story. 2 of these 3, or the next 3 stories are about them, 2 of the characters. The first one is about Sarai, his wife. Here's what happens. If you look at verses 5 through 9, it tells about Abraham's travels more, but eventually we find out there's this famine in the land in verse 10. There's a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman of beautiful appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, and they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. So there's this famine in the land. They go to Egypt. On their way to Egypt, Abraham conjures up this plan. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get to Egypt, and here's the deal. You are beautiful, right? And Sarah's like, I like this so far. It's like, but here's the thing. When we get there, the Egyptians are going to recognize you're beautiful. They're going to kill me, and they're going to take you. So let's skip the killing me part and just give you to them right away, right? So, enter some kind of marriage joke at this point. This is not going good for Abraham. So the plan is enacted. That baby thought it was hilarious. Verse 14 through 16. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, just like Abram said it would. They would. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house, and for her sake he dealt with Abraham. He gave him sheep, so he had all the sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. So what he said was going to happen, and Abraham is blessed because of what the Egyptians think is his sister. But it's verses 17 through 20, God intercedes. So 10 through 16 is Abraham's plan. It's Abraham's plan enacted. But God enters on the scene in verse 17. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So Pharaoh called Abraham and said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I would... So I took her for my wife. Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So again, you have the first breakdown, 10 through 16 is Abram's plan, 17 through 20 is God interceding. And what he's interceding for is, first and foremost, remember, Abram's God's plan for the nations. It starts with a lie on top of a famine. So it starts with this lie, and then on top of this lie, there's these plagues that are involved that go to the Egyptians. So that doesn't seem to be going well. And I know that there's some things that you could say Abraham is prostituting out his wife. There are certain cultural components to this that might be missed, if I'm being honest. There are certain things and elements that culturally it's not exactly the same, but here's what we know. If I was to take my wife Candace and say, "Hey, listen, this guy's going to pay me a bunch of money if you go be with him, by all intents and purposes, that would be prostitution. And I'm not trying to be like funny, but he is honestly, in some ways, in our modern moment, would be seen as a pimp pimping out his wife. And even if I'm wrong on all the cultural details, the reality is God is not okay with it. Because 17 through 20 is God interceding. So that's the second story. God leaves his land, then you have Abram and Sarah's wife. It's not going well so far. Let's go to the next story, chapter 13, verse 1. We're going to come back to these, but we got 5 stories to unpack. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he journeyed on from Negeb as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai. So you can read back that's back in the promised land. Verse 4. So the place where he had made an altar at first, that was in chapter 12, verse 7, if you want to know where that is. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen and Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And at that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. So the Perizzites and the Canaanites are the future enemies of Israel. The point of this passage, though, is found in that statement, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. So obviously God is blessing Abraham. Lot, his nephew, and all of their herdsmen, it's growing. And Abraham's herdsmen, and it's growing. But they're starting to fight because who gets what patch of grass, and there's arguments. And so, again, Abraham comes up with a plan, just like he did going into Egypt. The plan plays itself out in verses 8 through 13. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen." And here's what happens in 9. "It is not the whole land before you. Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I'll go to the right. If you take the right hand, I'll go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zorah. That was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. In short, the plan is simple. It plays itself out. He sees the Jordan Valley. Lot goes, "I want that area." He goes east. We'll say Abraham, even though it kind of goes, a little bit more south, he goes west, and so they separate ways, okay? And it feels like this is a good answer. We get some details there in verse 10 about Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't there yet, or I'm sorry, wasn't destroyed yet. And so, that's good. But then again, just like in the section before, the Lord comes on the scene. In verse 14, the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes. Look from this place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. And all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar of the Lord. Now here's what I want you to do, if you can. Before we unpack verses 14 and 17, can you look back at verse 7 in chapter 13 for me? If you notice in verse 7, it gives this inconspicuous detail. Notice how it says, "At that time, there's the Canaanites and the Perizzites." Well, that seems like weird. And then in verse 10, draw your attention to verse 10. There's another detail, this time in parentheses. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now those seem insignificant, but they help us understand a little bit verses 14 through 17 or 18. In that, it's like this. I grew up in Phoenix, and in growing up in Phoenix, I was taught American history, okay? But being taught American history, I don't know the places that I'm learning about as a 7th grader. But if you are here and you grew up in Boston or Washington, D.C., and you're learning about American history, you can quite literally go out your door and maybe 20 minutes away, you've walked by at some point or possibly took a field trip, you are aware of the very things that you're learning. They are there for a real person to see in reality, okay? In the same way, we're reading this, and it's giving us these details that we know nothing of. But the reader, the little boy in Torah class, as he knows this, he goes, oh, wait a minute, I thought Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. This is before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. This is before the Amorites came on the scene. And suddenly it's beginning to click. Now, the reason that matters is the statement in verse 15, all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. This is a real promise of real land to real people. God is doubling down in what he did in the first 3 verses of chapter 12. And he's saying, hey, listen, this is a very real, I'm talking to you. And they would know that he's talking to them. And that statement there, and then he built an altar of the Lord, is a full cycle of where we go back to in chapter 12. And so that's the 3rd story. So I want to pause. I know we're putting all these stories together. We now get to the 4th story, chapter 14. Just keep tracking. It's a lot. I get it. Okay? I'm going to summarize the first 9 verses for us of chapter 14 because there's a bunch of names I don't know how to pronounce. Okay? So here's what happens. There's this battle, and it seems like, what? This random battle appears. What's going on is there's 4 kingdoms, 4 kings that have these major kingdoms, and they're large, and they're powerful, okay? There's 5 other kingdoms that are weak, but they're tired of being under these 4 kingdoms. Predominantly one of the kings who's over the 4 kingdoms. You can see his name there if you look at verses 1 through 9. Chedorlaomer, I don't know how we want to pronounce that, but that's him. So what happens is they, after being in subjugation, these 5 weak kingdoms under these 4 kingdoms, after being in subjugation underneath these other kings for 12 years, in the 13th year they go, we're done. So then in the 14th year, that king goes, then we're going to battle. And so they battle it out. Now you may be wondering why all this matters, because when they battle it out, the 5 kingdoms that are weak, who have less people, actually end up beating the 4 powerful kingdoms, and they push them back. Well, on their way to the retreat, pick it up in verse 10, the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen and pits. They're on retreat. As the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fell into the hill country. Verse 11, so the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. Now, why does that matter? We're talking about Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 13. This is a setup for something. Who do we know is in Sodom and Gomorrah, by Sodom and Gomorrah? Lot. So we get this random story of this battle to set up and understand that Lot is going to be taken away. And that's what happens. When these kings are on retreat, the people are pushing them away, they plunder Sodom and Gomorrah. And in plundering Sodom and Gomorrah, they plunder the people around Sodom and Gomorrah, which includes Lot. And you can see that in verse 12. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went on their way. Well, here's what happens. Abram hears about this by 2 of his guys. We'll pick it up in verse 14. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, 18 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and he also brought back his kinsman Lot, with his possessions, and the women and the people. And so Abram, 318 guys is what he has. We are led to believe that there are more than that in the kingdoms that end up taking this from the 5 weaker kingdoms. But he ends up going back, getting Lot, taking them. Great, okay? Let's stop for a second. Especially if you're new to church, you're new to Christianity, you're sitting there thinking, that's a lot of information, and you're not wrong, okay? I read these first, these 3 chapters here, and if I'm being honest, it feels chaotic. We're asking this big question, God, in light of chapter 11, all the nations are before you, but there's brokenness in all of these nations. What's the plan here? And as I said, his response is Abram, and our response to his response is going, are you sure? Because I'm reading these stories, and everything you're promising, I'm looking, for example, the nations, they're being cursed because of him. I mean, they get plagues because of him. Abram almost loses his wife in all this, which, by the way, are important for the descendants portion of the promise. You also see Abraham, and not just losing his wife, it's a 50-50 shot. Imagine a 13-year-old boy, Jewish boy, going through Torah class, and Abram goes, choose one of the sides of the land. You're sitting there going, you're telling me it was up to Lot? He could have chosen the promised land? Then what do we do? I'm reading all of this, and I go, this feels fragile. This whole thing, as I go through this, the whole thing feels fragile. We are one arrow in a battle away from ending Abraham's life. One heartbeat. That's it. This big promise for the nations is like so fragile in this moment. It's chaos ridden. It's full of like what's going on. And then I'm reminded in all of this, as I see this, like I look through this, I look at chapter 14, verse 13, and I see there's a way, which we didn't read 13 intentionally, there's a way that God is describing, or Moses is describing Abram, that matters. I want you to notice in verse 13 that it says, then the one who escaped came and told Abram, and it gives a descriptive statement there. See it? Describes him as the Hebrew. Now, you want to know why the Hebrew statement there matters? Because there were people living in Arizona in 1450. There were. I'm assuming Native Americans. Somebody was here, right? Somebody in the scope of Arizona. Let's assume they were there. Well, would we call people in 1411 Arizonans? No, because Arizona wasn't made yet. Now, this is confusing because Abram's called a Hebrew, but the Hebrews are not a thing yet. But the people who are reading the text are called the Hebrews, and now suddenly it dawns on them, wait a minute, Abram the Hebrew, we're the Hebrews. And the promise suddenly isn't about Abraham, it's not about me, it's not about the fragility of the land or the people. It comes to light that chapters 12, 13, and 14 are about God. Regardless of the chaos, regardless of the fragility, this big promise to the nations are in the hands of a hobbit to save Middle Earth. I mean, honestly, what is in front of you is the simplicity of everything that could so easily fall apart is held together because God has got it. He's the God of the Hebrews, but the Hebrews haven't even made yet. I promise I'll call my shot. They'll be the Hebrews. He's got it on lock, which helps us understand the next portion. And this will be our last story. Can I just say this, by the way? This is God's MO constantly through the rest of the Bible. As Spurgeon says, God doesn't need your strength. He has plenty of that. He has plenty of that. He needs your weakness. And so what you have in front of you is you have stories of Moses, not because of his strength. You have stories of Gideon, even too powerful, reduces the army. It's not about his strength. I'm reading 1 Samuel in my study time right now, and the first king is Saul, and it's because how great Saul is. He's head and shoulders above everyone else. He's good looking, he's smart, but he fails. And you know who the next king is? The king that everyone else remembers, the king in which the line of Jesus will come through. He's not even the strongest in his family. He's a shepherd boy. His name is David. It's not about your strength. It's about the one who's holding you in your weakness. And so this is what we see. Now, can I just say this as a side note? That's true for us now. As a matter of fact, this is one of the texts that was shared on Tuesday. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, it says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay. Now, if you want to know what the treasure is, you can read verses 1 through 6. It's the gospel. The gospel is in jars of clay. You want to know who the jars of clay is? You and me. Literally, the hope of the world, of all the nations, is in us, jars of clay. Why would God take the most majestic, most important message for all of mankind and put it in something so fragile? A jar, if I drop it right now, would break. Why would he do that? We don't have to guess. Verse 7 tells us, 2 Corinthians 4:7, but we have this treasure in jars of clay. Why? To show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. It's not about Abraham. It's not about his descendants. It's not about how strong they will be or how great of a nation they will become. It's about the surpassing power of God. Now, if you don't believe me, our last story is story number 5, verse 17. It says this. Now, just to sum up, 21 through 24 is kind of putting a bow on that whole battle thing that took place. Abraham keeps his integrity. He gives these kings back their stuff except the food that his men ate. But it is verses 17 through 20 that will be brought up again and again in the Bible. You will not find the story of Sarai and Abraham in Egypt again in Scripture. You won't find this whole lot dividing the land again. It won't be mentioned again in Scripture. There has been more ink spilled based on these 3 chapters on verses 17 through 20 and chapter 14 than any of the other verses. I had to write a paper making a decision on what's going on in verses 17 through 20 because it's that big of a deal in my undergrad. Here's what it says. What seems to be a random story. After his return from the defeat, this is Abram, of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Describes this king of Salem as he was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him, and he said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. I get it. If you're new to Christianity or you haven't been studying the Bible for a long time, most likely maybe you're going through a Bible in the year right now. You probably already through this passage. You read that story and you went, "That's not a big deal. Let's move on." Or you read it and goes, "What on earth was that?" I mean, I read it and I go, there's this guy Melchizedek. He's the king of Salem. Great. He's a priest of the Most High God. We didn't know about that. Where has he been this whole time? Then Abram is blessed by him. And then at the end there, you can see Abram gives a tithe to him. Now, who is this guy? And so here you are, a little 13-year-old boy again in Torah class, learning about this. You know about Melchizedek, but that's all you know. But here's the good news. It's brought up again. If you can, turn your Bibles to Psalm 110. In Psalm 110, you're learning about Psalm 110 and you read it. It is a prophecy about the coming Messiah. Because God has promised that he has a plan for the nations, his plan for the nations is his coming Messiah. And so throughout the whole Old Testament, there continues to be this beating of the drum about the Messiah. He's going to come, he's going to come, he's going to come, he's going to do this. Well, in Psalm 110 are these prophecies and these things we could know all about the Messiah. That's what all of Psalm 110 is about. It says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at your right hand, or sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool." It's probably the most famous part of Psalm 110, kind of a conversation into the Trinity. "The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power. The holy garments from the womb of the morning and the dew of your youth will be yours." Verse 5, if you can. "The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath." Verse 6, "He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He shall shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head." A bunch of prophecies fulfilled in Jesus, which I'm going to leave for a second. All this little Jewish boy knows is these are what we're looking for this coming Messiah. That's what we're looking for. Now, we intentionally skipped over verse 4 because one of the prophecies that we're told about this coming Messiah is verse 4. "The Lord has sworn and he will not change his mind," describing now the Messiah that's to come. "Messiah, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." Wait, what? Hold on a second. Rabbi, I know about Melchizedek. Didn't he appear in Genesis chapter 14? He was this king that Abraham was blessed by and he gave a tithe. The Messiah is going to be in the order of Melchizedek. And so now suddenly I'm waiting for this Messiah and all these other things to be in this orderly priesthood of Melchizedek, which I still don't know much about. Well, here's the good news. You're not a little 13-year-old Jewish boy in Torah class, okay? We have complete 2020 vision in front of us. The good news is we live in a time where the Lord has given us his complete canon, and now we have all the information we need. So I'm going to ask you to turn to one more place, and that is Hebrews chapter 7. In Hebrews chapter 7, this is the portion where I said we're going to read a lot of scripture and a lot of stories. But on the other hand, here's what we also have to do is, for a moment, I got to treat this like a seminary class. And in some ways, I do apologize for that, but there's no way of getting around that. But we have to understand that the writer of Hebrews is now talking about Jesus, who we now know is the Messiah. And in talking about Jesus, Jesus is better than the angels. He's better than the promised land. He's better than Moses. He's also a better priest. But the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah, and this Messiah is a priest. But we know from Psalm 110 that he's in the priesthood of Melchizedek. So what do we do with all this? And so finally, we get to Hebrews chapter 7, and in the first 3 verses, the writer of Hebrews tells us what we already know. What do we already know? It says this in verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 7. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abram returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. We know that story. We just read it. And to him, Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. We just read that. Now it's just going to describe his name. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. That's what Melchizedek means. And then he is also King of Salem. That is the King of Peace. Verse 3, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Okay, let's stop for a second. I think it's starting to make sense for a second. This random story at the end of chapter 14 in Genesis has this random guy appear randomly out of nowhere. But it's actually intentional. The reason we don't know about this guy is because he doesn't have a genealogy. He doesn't have a father and mother. He's a priesthood that is eternal. This priest of God that was in chapter 14, the details are just laid out. He's this king of peace. The good news is, verses 4 all the way to verse 10, now explain. So we just read the details of what we already know. Now explain what we need to do with all this. What on earth is going on? Here it is. See how great this man is, or see how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from the brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. So if you don't know the story, the descendants of Abraham end up as 12 tribes. One of the tribes is a priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi. The 11 tribes have to give a tithe to Levi. That's what that's explaining here. That'll be important here in a minute, okay? But this man who does not have commandment in the law to take tithes from people, that is, does not have his descent from them receive tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises. Verse 7, it is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the same one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. And some of you are going, I still don't understand what's going on here, okay? Which is fine. Let me explain what the writer of Hebrews is trying to explain here so we can understand the details of it. The only way to do it is to create a problem in your mind. Here's the problem. How can Jesus offer a sacrifice? Because let me ask you this. Does Jesus, as a priest first, offer a sacrifice of himself? Meaning Jesus is both priest and sacrifice when he enters in, and that's what we understand, Jesus entering into the most holy temple, ultimately giving him his life away. And the answer is yes. He gives himself as a sacrifice as a priest. But let me ask you a question. If he's going to fulfill the law, how is that possible? Because the only people who can give sacrifices are Levites. And Jesus isn't a Levite. He's from the tribe of Judah. Therefore, his sacrifice is null and void. What he did on the cross to sacrifice himself for you and I, the redemption of all things, is void. It should not count because he's not a priest. So what do we do with this? Well, verses 4 through 10 explain to us that the way that we understand Levites are priests is because they come from Abraham. But there's a priesthood greater than the priesthood of the Levites. There is a priesthood beyond the priesthood of the Levites, more eternal before and far after, that is beyond that. Because here's what we know, and we see it in two parts there. Part one is, we know that as Melchizedek, he blesses Abraham. Look at verse 7. It is apparently beyond dispute. It's beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. So Abram blesses the loins, the fruit of his loins, the generations after him. He blesses them, as does Israel to the 12 tribes, because Abraham is greater than Levi. But if Abraham is greater than Levi, and the greater blesses the inferior, then Melchizedek is greater than Abram. And that means the Melchizedek priesthood is greater than the priesthood of the Levites. Secondly, look at verses 9 and 10. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham. That is, he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Abraham gives tithes to Melchizedek. Why does that matter? Because the rest of the tribes gave tithes to the priests, the Levites. You could say, as the text is saying here, that the Levites actually paid their tithes. They don't pay tithes, they receive tithes. They paid their tithes through Abraham to Melchizedek because he's the greater priesthood. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, Jesus is part of that priesthood. He comes from the tribe of Judah, and he goes on to say at the rest of chapter 7 and all into 8, he comes from the tribe of Judah, but what we know to be true is the Levites will fail. They're fragile, they're weak, they're temporal. Their sacrifices will not last forever. We need something more permanent. We need some longevity to this. We need a density to this, because the Levitical priesthood will fail, and in the middle of chaos, in the middle of fragility, in the middle of God, are you sure Abraham's your man? He drops a story going, let me tell you who the hope of the nations is. It's not Abraham. It's not his people. It's not the generations. It's not the land. It is my son. That's the density of the promise that we have in front of us. The hope for all nations is Jesus. The hope for everyone, everything, the restoration of all things is Jesus. And Jesus is part of a bigger priesthood than just the Levites. He's part of the Melchizedek priesthood. And that settles us in as we go into chapter 15. Let's pray.